Alicia Brooks, the brilliant diamond of the South, built a multi-billion-dollar empire on the foundation of her parents' legacy. Her life seemed perfect when she married Malcolm Brooks, but it was all a perfect lie. When a catastrophic car accident left Alicia in a 2-month coma and confined to a wheelchair, Malcolm revealed his true face. He ruthlessly stole her properties, emptied her accounts, and served her divorce papers while she was still in her hospital bed. But the story of Alicia changes when she slips from her wheelchair. However, fate has other plans when a Korean Mafia boss, Yi-won Kim, happens to pass by and rushes to her aid. Welcome home, family. You've joined a community that celebrates the strength of the human spirit. Like Alicia, we know that hitting rock bottom is just the foundation for a comeback. Thank you for riding with us. Let's dive in story of Alicia and witness some incredible transformations together. Alicia Brooks didn't just inherit an empire. She inherited a legacy forged in iron and refined by the fire of tragedy. The Brooks name had always been synonymous with the skyline of Atlanta, a testament to her parents' relentless drive and vision. As a young girl, Alicia moved through the marbled halls of their Buckhead estate, not as a child of leisure, but as a student of power. She watched her father navigate boardroom shark tanks with a calm that bordered on the supernatural, and her mother manage complex philanthropic foundations with a heart that never forgot its humble roots. They were her world, her teachers, and her shield. That shield shattered on a humid Tuesday evening when Alicia was only 16. The details of the robbery were a blur of siren lights and the cold, clinical smell of a hospital waiting room, but the outcome was a permanent scar on her soul. In a single hour of senseless violence, the young heiress became an orphan. The vast wealth they left behind, the real estate holdings, the tech patents, and the liquid millions, felt like a mountain of cold, hard stone pressing down on her chest. Most expected the young Alicia to crumble, to let the board of directors parcel out her inheritance, while she retreated into a life of quiet, shadowed grief. They didn't know the girl who had sat at the foot of her father's desk since she could walk. While her peers were navigating the social hierarchies of elite private schools, Alicia was drowning herself in spreadsheets and legal briefs, using the work as a lifeboat to keep from sinking into her sorrow. She wasn't just maintaining the Brooks legacy, she was evolving it. By the time she reached her mid-20s, Alicia had transformed the family business into Brooks Global, an untouchable conglomerate. She moved through the business world with a grace that masked a razor-sharp instinct. She was elegant, possessing high cheekbones and a gaze that could pin a dishonest executive to their chair from across a room. Her almond-shaped eyes missed nothing, and her voice, though soft, carried the weight of a woman who had seen the bottom of the world and decided she belonged at the top. She became a fixture on the covers of business magazines, hailed as the diamond of the South. Her wealth was staggering, but to Alicia, the money was merely a scorecard for her survival. Her mansion, though filled with the finest art and most modern luxuries, often felt more like a museum than a home. She had the indoor pools, the fleet of luxury cars she rarely had time to drive, and the respect of every titan in the industry. She had built herself into a fortress, strong and impenetrable. Yet, despite the billions and the headlines, there was a quiet, hollow ache that no successful merger could fill. She was a woman who had everything the world told her to want, but she was still the 16-year-old girl sitting alone in a dark house, wishing for a family to come home to. She had conquered the business world, rising further than even her father had dreamed, but as she stood on the balcony of her penthouse overlooking the city she helped build, she realized that power was a lonely throne. She had mastered the art of the deal, but she had yet to learn the art of being loved for the woman behind the wealth, rather than the empire she stood upon. She was Alicia Brooks, the orphan heiress who had won the world, but in her heart, she was still waiting for someone to see the girl who just wanted to belong. Malcolm Brooks entered Alicia's life not with a bang, but with the subtle, intoxicating persistence of a summer fog. It was at a high-stakes charity auction for underprivileged youth, a cause close to Alicia's heart, where he first made his move. While other men approached her with trembling hands or transparently greedy eyes, Malcolm stood at the edge of the champagne bar, watching her with an expression of quiet, respectful curiosity. When he finally stepped forward, he didn't mention her recent acquisition of a downtown skyscraper or the Forbes list she had recently climbed. Instead, he spoke of the nuance in the brushstrokes of the local art she had just purchased, his voice a smooth, velvet baritone that seemed to vibrate in the hollow space of her chest. He was handsome in a way that felt safe, with a broad, welcoming face and a smile that suggested he held the keys to a kingdom of genuine warmth. To an orphan who had spent her life surrounded by cold marble and colder boardrooms, Malcolm felt like the first embers of a long-awaited fire. He portrayed himself as a man of modest success, but immense character, a consultant who valued the human element over the bottom line. He listened with a focused intensity that Alicia had never experienced. When she spoke of the loneliness of her childhood or the weight of her parents' legacy, Malcolm didn't offer platitudes. He offered a hand to hold and a shoulder that felt like a foundation. The courtship was a masterclass in emotional manipulation, though Alicia saw only the perfect lie. He was always there exactly when the silence of her mansion became too loud. He brought her flowers not because it was a Tuesday, but because he remembered she mentioned liking that specific scent of jasmine in passing 3 weeks ago. He didn't ask for her money. In fact, he made a grand show of insisting on paying for their dinners at small, out-of-the-way bistros, creating an illusion of financial independence that soothed Alicia's inherent distrust of gold diggers. He convinced her that he saw the girl behind the billion-dollar mask, the one who still missed her parents' laughter. Within 6 months, the fortress Alicia had spent a decade building began to crumble under the weight of her own desire to be loved. Malcolm became her world, her advisor, and her closest confidant. He subtly began to distance her from her long-standing legal team, suggesting that corporate sharks didn't understand the sanctity of a private life. He spoke of building a new legacy together, one where the Brooks name wasn't just about glass and steel, but about a family that would never be broken again. Alicia, blinded by the flickering light of hope, didn't notice that he was slowly mapping the cracks in her armor. The wedding was the ultimate performance of Malcolm's career. It was a $3 million fairy tale at the Brooks family estate, a spectacle designed to signal to the world that the diamond of the South had finally found her setting. Alicia was breathtaking in a gown of hand-stitched lace, her long, wavy hair crowned with a tiara that had belonged to her mother. As she walked down the aisle, her heart hammered against her ribs with a joy so intense it felt like pain. She looked at Malcolm, standing at the altar in a sleek tuxedo, his eyes appearing to shimmer with tears. She thought she was walking toward her future. She didn't realize she was walking into a trap. The reception was a blur of high-profile guests, vintage champagne, and a string quartet playing the same songs her parents had danced to. Malcolm was the perfect groom, charming her business associates and dancing with the elderly aunts she rarely saw. When he leaned in to whisper, "Everything I am is yours, Alicia," she believed him with every fiber of her being. She felt the hollow ache in her heart finally close, replaced by the solid presence of a husband who promised to stand by her side until the end of time. As the night ended and they looked out over the sprawling estate, Alicia felt a profound sense of peace. She had the empire, and now she had the love she had prayed for. She fell asleep that night in the arms of the man she trusted most in the world, blissfully unaware that Malcolm was already wide awake, mentally revising the signatures on her deeds and counting the days until he could finally stop pretending. The fairy tale was complete, but for Malcolm Brooks, the real work was only just beginning. The night was thick with a heavy, oppressive rain that seemed determined to swallow the very lights of the Atlanta skyline. Alicia Brooks was behind the wheel of her sleek black SUV, her mind still humming with the details of the billion-dollar merger she had just finalized. It was late, the kind of hour where the world feels deserted and the asphalt turns into a dark, shimmering mirror. She had called Malcolm 3 times, wanting to share the thrill of her victory, but the calls had gone straight to voicemail. She figured he was already asleep in their sanctuary, waiting for her with the quiet warmth he had promised would always be there. The intersection at Peachtree and 14th was a blur of neon reflections and gray mist. Alicia eased off the accelerator, her wipers fighting a losing battle against the deluge. She never saw the truck. It emerged from the darkness like a ghost, a massive wall of steel and glass that had ignored the red light. There was a split second, a heartbeat of pure, crystalline terror, where the world slowed down. Alicia saw the white spray of the tires, heard the agonizing shriek of brakes that couldn't find purchase on the slick road. And then, the world exploded into a cacophony of twisting metal and shattering glass. The impact was a violent, jarring force that tossed her luxury vehicle like a toy. Alicia felt the air leave her lungs as the side curtain airbags deployed in a flash of white, but they were no match for the sheer momentum. Her head snapped back, then forward, a blinding white light searing through her vision before a terrifying, absolute darkness rushed in to meet it. The SUV spun into a lamppost, the sound of the metal groan echoing through the empty street until there was nothing left but the rhythmic, haunting click of a broken turn signal and the hiss of steam rising into the cold rain. When the paramedics arrived, they found a woman who looked more like a broken doll than the diamond of the South. Her long, wavy hair was matted with blood, and the elegant features that had graced a dozen magazine covers were pale and still. They worked with a frantic, professional desperation, their voices muffled by the downpour. "We're losing her," someone shouted over the roar of a siren. They didn't know they were holding the Brooks legacy in their hands. They only saw a life flickering like a candle in a gale. At Emory Hospital, the clinical hum of the ICU became Alicia's new reality, though she was miles away from it. The diagnosis was grim: severe spinal trauma and a deep, unresponsive coma. As the machines took over the labor of her lungs and the steady, artificial beat of her heart, Alicia drifted into a vast, silent ocean. In the waking world, her name was being whispered in boardrooms and newsrooms across the country. But in the darkness of her mind, there was only the memory of the rain and the terrifying sensation of falling. Malcolm arrived 3 hours after the accident, his face a carefully constructed mask of devastating grief. He paced the waiting room, his eyes red-rimmed, accepting the condolences of the hospital staff with a practiced, somber nod. But as the sun began to rise over the city, and the doctors confirmed that Alicia's brain was retreating into a deep, long-term defensive sleep, the sorrow in Malcolm's eyes began to shift. He stood by her bed, looking down at the woman who had given him everything. Alicia was surrounded by tubes and wires, her chest rising and falling with the rhythmic hiss of the ventilator. To the world, he was the grieving husband praying for a miracle. To himself, he was a man who had just been handed the keys to the kingdom while the gatekeeper was locked in a room with no door. As the first week of her coma turned into the second, the perfect lie didn't just persist, it evolved. Malcolm realized that as long as Alicia remained in that silent, dark ocean, her empire was a ship without a captain, and he was the only one left on deck. The 2-month countdown had begun, and while Alicia fought for every breath in the silence, Malcolm began to move with a terrifying, silent precision in the light. While Alicia was adrift in the silent, lightless vacuum of her coma, the mansion she had once called a sanctuary transformed into the hunting ground of a predator. Malcolm Brooks did not waste a single hour. To the medical staff at Emory, he was the picture of the devoted, grieving husband, often seen slumped in a chair by her bedside with his head in his hands. But beneath that calculated veneer of sorrow, his mind was a high-speed ledger, calculating the most efficient way to dismantle a legacy that had taken decades to build. The theft began with the small, intimate details that only a husband could access. Malcolm returned to their Buckhead estate, moving through the rooms with a new, proprietary swagger. He opened her heavy mahogany desk, his fingers tracing the gold-embossed stationery as if he were already imagining his own name in its place. He knew the digital rhythms of her life, the passwords she used, the biometrics she trusted. On the 4th night of her hospitalization, while the city outside was asleep, Malcolm sat in the glow of her dual-monitor setup, his face illuminated by the flickering light of accounts that held more wealth than he had ever dreamed of seeing. He moved with the cold, surgical precision of a scavenger. He didn't just transfer funds, he rerouted the very veins of Brooks Global. Using the power of attorney documents, he had subtly coaxed her into signing during their fairytale honeymoon, under the guise of mutual protection. He began the systematic erasure of Alicia's name. He started with the offshore accounts in the Caymans and Luxembourg, moving the liquid assets into a series of shell companies he had established months prior. Each click of the mouse was a silent blow to the empire her father had bled for. The real estate was next. Alicia's parents had left her a portfolio of historic Atlanta landmarks and prime commercial developments. Malcolm spent his days in the offices of unsuspecting notaries and low-level legal clerks, presenting himself as the frantic husband trying to consolidate the estate to cover Alicia's mounting medical costs. He forged her delicate, elegant signature with a practiced hand, transferring the deeds of the Buckhead mansion, the downtown skyscrapers, and the beach house in Savannah into his sole ownership. He watched the digital ink dry on the new titles with a smirk that never reached his eyes. He was a paperwork predator, consuming her life from the inside out. He sold off her rare art collection to private buyers in London, claiming the pieces were being moved for safekeeping. He cleared out the safe deposit boxes, pocketing the jewelry that had been in the Brooks family for generations. The emeralds her mother wore to the opera, the gold watch her father received when he took the company public. To Malcolm, these weren't memories, they were currency. Even as he gutted her finances, he worked to isolate her professionally. He sent out meticulously crafted emails from her private account to the board of directors, hinting at long-term cognitive impairment and permanent incapacitation. He painted a picture of a woman who was already gone, effectively gaslighting an entire corporation while the founder lay helpless in a hospital gown. He replaced her longtime head of security and her personal assistant with his own consultants, men who were paid for their silence and their lack of a moral compass. By the end of the second month, the transformation was nearly complete. On paper, Alicia Brooks was a ward of the state with dwindling resources. On paper, Malcolm Brooks was one of the most powerful men in the South. He would visit her occasionally, standing at the foot of her bed with a glass of the vintage scotch her father had saved for a special occasion. He would look at her still, pale face and feel nothing but a sense of profound triumph. She was the diamond of the South, but he had finally found a way to crush the diamond into dust. As the nurses whispered about his unwavering loyalty, Malcolm was already drafting the final document, the divorce petition that would ensure that, when Alicia finally woke up, she would find herself a stranger in her own world. The transition from the deep, lightless ocean of a coma back to the waking world was not a sudden splash, but a slow, agonizing crawl through shards of broken glass. For Alicia Brooks, consciousness began as a series of disconnected sensations. The rhythmic, clinical hiss of a ventilator, the dry, metallic taste on her tongue, and a distant, dull ache that seemed to emanate from a body she could no longer feel. When she finally forced her eyes open, the harsh, fluorescent lights of the ICU felt like physical blows. She waited for Malcolm. In those first hazy hours of lucidity, she expected his warm hand to clasp hers, to hear his voice telling her that the nightmare was over. She imagined he would be there, perhaps disheveled from weeks of vigil, ready to carry her back to the life they had built. But as the fog of sedation thinned, Alicia realized the chair beside her bed was empty. The luxury bouquets that should have filled the room were absent. There was only the smell of industrial antiseptic and the relentless, lonely beep of a heart monitor that sounded more like a countdown than a sign of life. On the third day of her awakening, the head neurologist arrived with a look of practiced, heavy-hearted sympathy. He spoke of the severe spinal trauma and the unresponsive lower extremities. He used words like permanent and irreversible as if they were simple medical facts rather than the death sentences of the woman she used to be. Alicia tried to move her toes, a mental command she sent with every ounce of her remaining will, but her legs remained heavy, distant pillars of stone. She was a captive in her own skin, a queen who had lost her mobility and, as she would soon discover, her kingdom. The blow that finally shattered her didn't come from a doctor, however. It came from a man in a cheap, wrinkled suit who walked into her room with the silent efficiency of a shadow. He didn't ask how she felt. He didn't offer a word of comfort. "Alicia Brooks?" the man asked, his voice flat. Alicia nodded weakly, her throat still raw from the intubation. "You've been served," he said, dropping a thick legal packet onto her lap, the lap she could no longer feel. Her trembling fingers fumbled with the envelope. The header at the top of the document felt like a physical strike, petition for dissolution of marriage. Beneath it, in the cold, mechanical font of the Georgia court system, were the terms of her erasure. Malcolm wasn't just asking for a divorce. He was claiming a total and irretrievable breakdown of the marriage due to her permanent incapacitation. She scanned the pages, her breath hitching in her chest. It wasn't just a separation. The documents detailed the transfer of Brooks Global, the sale of her parents' mansion, and the liquidation of the trust funds she had worked a decade to protect. Malcolm had cited her inability to manage affairs, and used the power of attorney she had given him in a moment of romantic vulnerability to sign away her life while she slept. Every property, every patent, every cent of the legacy her father had forged in fire was now in Malcolm's name. He hadn't even come to tell her himself. He had sent a process server to a woman who couldn't stand up to face him. "Where is he?" Alicia rasped, the words catching in her dry throat. "Where is my husband?" The server didn't answer. He was already at the door, his job finished. Later that evening, a nurse arrived with a standard hospital-issue wheelchair. It was a cold, clunky contraption of chrome and black vinyl, a far cry from the velvet-lined seats of her luxury SUVs. "We need to get you moving, honey," the nurse said gently, unaware that she was assisting in Alicia's final displacement. As Alicia was hoisted into the chair, the reality of her situation settled over her like a shroud. She looked at her reflection in the darkened window of the hospital room. The diamond of the South was gone. In her place sat a woman with hollowed eyes and a spirit that felt as paralyzed as her legs. She was an orphan once again, divorced, dispossessed, and discarded. Malcolm had taken her trust and used it to build a wall between her and the world she had built. As the nurse wheeled her toward the hallway, the divorce papers remained clutched in Alicia's hand, the ink a testament to the perfect lie she had lived. She was leaving the hospital not for her home, but for a government-subsidized facility. The legacy of the Brooks family had been reduced to a legal packet and a chair with wheels. Malcolm had one. He had left her with nothing but the rain that was beginning to lash against the hospital windows once more, mocking the woman who had trusted a predator with her heart. The government-subsidized housing was a cold, gray structure that sat on the frayed edges of the city, a place where hope went to be forgotten. For Alicia, every day was a repetitive cycle of staring at the peeling wallpaper and mourning a life that felt like it belonged to a ghost. She was a woman who had once commanded boardrooms, now reduced to counting the minutes between meager meals. The isolation was the worst part. Malcolm had not only stolen her wealth, he had erased her existence. No one called, no one came. Desperate for a moment of fresh air that didn't smell of industrial floor wax, Alicia decided to venture out on a Tuesday evening. The sky was a bruised purple, heavy with the promise of another Atlanta downpour. She navigated her clunky, hospital-issue wheelchair toward a small convenience store 3 blocks away, her arms aching from the unfamiliar strain. She just needed a bottle of water, something she had chosen and paid for herself. The rain didn't start with a drizzle. It began with a sudden, violent deluge. Within seconds, the slick urban street turned into a treacherous mirror. Alicia panicked, her fingers slipping on the wet metal rims of her wheels. As she tried to navigate a steep curb near a darkened alleyway, a front wheel caught a deep crack in the pavement. The chair jerked, losing its center of gravity. Alicia gasped as the world tilted. She was thrown onto the cold, wet asphalt, her white satin robe soaking up the grime of the gutter. She lay there, shocked and helpless, the rain stinging her eyes. She tried to push herself up, but her hands slipped in the oily puddles. She felt utterly subhuman, a broken thing discarded in the rain while the world moved on around her. Above, on the balcony of a high-end loft overlooking the street, she saw a figure. For a terrifying second, she thought it was Malcolm, watching her with a glass of wine and that same smug, indifferent smirk. The humiliation was more paralyzing than her injuries. Then, the sound of a high-performance engine cut through the roar of the rain. A sleek, black motorcade pulled to the curb, the headlights cutting through the mist like twin blades. A man stepped out of the lead vehicle. He didn't run. He moved with a controlled, predatory grace that commanded the space around him. He wore a black tailored suit that seemed to absorb the shadows, his short, styled black hair quickly becoming damp. Alicia looked up, her almond-shaped eyes wide with vulnerability and confusion. She expected a passerby's pity or, worse, their averted gaze. Instead, she met an intense, focused stare. The man knelt beside her in the mud, heedless of his expensive clothing. He placed a strong, steady hand on her shoulder, his chiseled jawline tight with a mixture of concern and a dark, simmering protective energy. "Don't move," he said, his voice a deep, resonant calm that acted as an anchor in her storm. "I have you." As he gently lifted her from the pavement, his gaze searched her face. Suddenly, his brow furrowed, and the sharp intensity in his eyes softened into a flicker of profound recognition. "Alicia," he whispered. "Alicia Brooks." She blinked through the rain, squinting at the man who held her with such effortless strength. There was something in the set of his shoulders, a ghost of a memory from a decade ago. Suddenly, the cold street faded, replaced by the warm, sun-drenched library of an elite international school. Alicia saw herself at 20, a brilliant senior who spent her lunch hours tutoring the younger students. She remembered a quiet, intense boy in the back row, Yi-won Kim. He had been a junior, struggling with a complex economics assignment, his face shadowed by a loneliness he couldn't quite hide. He was the son of a powerful family, but he was an outsider, a boy caught between two worlds. Alicia had been the only one who didn't look at him with suspicion or fear. She had sat beside him, patiently explaining the nuances of market fluctuation, treating him not as a problem to be solved, but as a peer. She remembered the day he had handed her a small, hand-folded paper crane as a thank you. "You're the only person here who sees me," he had told her then. Back in the rain, the boy had become a man the city's underground spoke of in hushed, terrified tones. This was Yi-won Kim, the Korean Mafia boss whose influence was rumored to reach into the very foundations of the state. He wasn't the struggling student anymore. He was a titan of the shadows. "Yi-won," she rasped, her voice trembling. He didn't answer with words. He simply tightened his grip, pulling her closer to the warmth of his chest. He looked up at the balcony where the shadowy figure had been watching, his eyes flashing with a lethal, cold promise. "The debt I owe you has gathered 10 years of interest, Alicia," Yi-won said, his voice turning to ice as he signaled his men to retrieve her overturned wheelchair. "And I think it's time we started collecting." He carried her toward the waiting car, shielded by the umbrellas of his silent subordinates. For the first time since the accident, the weight of the world felt lighter. The orphan heiress had been found by the one person who remembered the girl she used to be, and he happened to be the most dangerous man she had ever known. Yi-won's estate was a fortress of glass and obsidian perched high above the city, a stark contrast to the decaying walls of the government housing Alicia had fled. Inside, the air was silent and carried the faint, expensive scent of cedar and rain. For the first week, Alicia lived in a state of surreal suspension. She was no longer a discarded ghost in a gutter. She was a guest of honor in a palace of shadows. Yi-won had spared no expense, transforming a sun-drenched wing of the mansion into a private recovery suite, complete with state-of-the-art rehabilitation equipment and a team of specialists who moved with the quiet efficiency of ghosts. Recovery, however, was a mountain that Alicia had to climb alone. Under the watchful eyes of Yi-won's private physicians, she began the grueling work of reconnecting her mind to a body that had been betrayed by both physics and a husband. The pain was a constant, searing companion, but it was nothing compared to the fire of her resolve. Every morning, as the sun broke over the horizon, Alicia pushed herself through agonizing physical therapy sessions. Yi-won was often there, standing silently in the doorway, his presence a steady, unyielding anchor. He didn't offer empty platitudes or pity. Instead, he watched her with a fierce, quiet respect that fueled her more than any medicine could. As her physical strength began to return, so did the sharp, analytical mind that had once built an empire. Between therapy sessions, the sunroom became a war room. Yi-won had secured every digital record, bank statement, and legal filing Malcolm had touched during Alicia's coma. They spent hours hunched over illuminated screens and stacks of paper, tracing the jagged path of Malcolm's theft. Alicia's almond-shaped eyes, once clouded by grief, were now narrow and predatory as she dissected the documents. It was during one of these late-night sessions that they found the crack in Malcolm's armor. Malcolm had been arrogant, believing Alicia would never wake up, or if she did, that she would be too broken to fight. Because of this hubris, his paperwork predator phase had been efficient but ultimately sloppy in its greed. Malcolm had used the power of attorney to transfer the deeds of Brooks Global's primary holdings into his name, but he had failed to notice a specific morality and lineage clause embedded deep within the Brooks family bylaws, a clause Alicia's father had added decades ago to protect against hostile takeovers. "He didn't liquidate the parent company's original charter," Alicia whispered, her voice gaining a strength it hadn't possessed in months. She pointed to a line of dense legal jargon on the screen. "He transferred the assets, but the authority to sell the final family estate, the crown jewel of the Brooks legacy, requires a unanimous board vote or the physical signature of a blood heir while they are of sound mind. By serving me divorce papers based on permanent incapacitation, while I was in a coma, he effectively locked himself out of the very power he tried to steal. Yi-Won leaned in, his sharp features illuminated by the blue light of the monitor. A cold, dangerous smile played at the corners of his lips. So, he owns the buildings, but he doesn't own the right to sell the ground they stand on. He's sitting on a throne made of glass, Alicia. And he's currently trying to sell that ground to an offshore consortium to wash the money, Alicia added, her mind racing. If he completes that sale, the Brooks legacy is gone forever, but he can't sign for it without me or a death certificate. The realization of how close she had come to a fatal accident sent a chill through the room, but it was quickly replaced by a cold, calculating rage. Malcolm was desperate. He had over-leveraged the stolen assets to fund his new, lavish lifestyle, and he needed this final sale to solidify his position. He thought he was closing in on his final victory, unaware that the woman he had discarded was currently rebuilding her strength in the heart of the city's most dangerous enclave. Yi-Won stood up, his tailored suit jacket pulling tight across his broad shoulders. He looked at Alicia, not as the girl who had tutored him, but as the partner she had become. We don't just take it back, Alicia. We let him think he's winning. We let him walk right to the edge of the cliff before we show him that the ground has already disappeared. I want him to see me, Alicia said, her voice steady and lethal. I want him to see the woman he thought was obsolete standing on her own 2 feet when his world collapses. Yi-Won nodded, his intense gaze locking onto hers. Then we move. My people will handle the digital trail. You handle the board. We trap him at the final signing. The plan was set. It would be a boardroom coup, executed with the precision of a military strike. As Alicia returned to her physical therapy that night, the pain in her legs felt like a promise. She wasn't just walking for herself anymore. She was walking toward the man who had tried to bury her, and she was bringing the shadows of the underworld with her. The Diamond of the South was no longer just a name. It was a weapon, and it was finally unsheathed. The conference room on the top floor of the Brooks Global headquarters was a vacuum of hushed anticipation and high-stakes tension. Outside, the Atlanta skyline was beginning to glow with the amber hues of dusk, but inside, the atmosphere was clinical and cold. Malcolm Brooks sat at the head of the massive obsidian table, his sleeves rolled up, a glass of vintage red wine sweating in his hand. He looked every bit the conqueror, his smug smirk wider than it had been in months. Today was the day he would finalize the sale of the Brooks family's final and most prestigious estate to an offshore consortium. Once the ink dried on this final signature, Alicia's legacy would be officially erased, and his stolen fortune would be untraceable. The board members sat in a line across from him, their faces masks of unease. They had been told Alicia was permanently incapacitated, a shadow of her former self, and they had reluctantly agreed to the sale under Malcolm's relentless pressure. "Gentlemen," Malcolm said, his voice dripping with an unearned authority, "we are minutes away from a new era for this company. Let's get these signatures out of the way so we can move on to the celebration." He reached for the gold-plated pen sitting atop the final deed, his fingers itching to complete the theft. But just as the nib touched the paper, the heavy double doors at the far end of the room swung open with a resounding thud. Malcolm didn't look up at first, his irritation clear. "I believe I said no interruptions," he snapped. "I don't think this interruption is one you can ignore, Malcolm." The voice was low, resonant, and carried a weight that made the wine glass in Malcolm's hand tremble. He froze. It wasn't just a voice, it was a ghost. He looked up, his smirk faltering as Yi-Won Kim stepped into the room. The Korean Mafia boss moved with a lethal, silent grace, his tailored black suit perfectly fitted, his sharp eyes locked onto Malcolm with a gaze that felt like a physical weight. "Yi-Won Kim," Malcolm stammered, his bravado beginning to leak out of him like air from a punctured tire. "What is the meaning of this? This is a private board meeting. You have no business here." "Actually," Yi-Won said, stepping aside to reveal the figure standing behind him, "I'm just here to provide the security. My business partner, however, has a great deal to say about this sale." The room went silent, a silence so thick it felt like it could shatter. Alicia Brooks walked into the room. She wasn't in the clunky hospital wheelchair. She was standing on her own 2 feet, dressed in a sleek ivory power suit that made her dark skin glow like polished mahogany. Her high cheekbones were set in a mask of absolute, icy resolve, and her almond-shaped eyes were narrowed as she fixed them on the man who had tried to bury her. She moved slowly, using a slim, carbon fiber cane for balance, but her posture was that of a queen returning to her throne. Malcolm's face drained of color, turning a sickly shade of gray. The glass in his hand slipped, shattering against the obsidian table, the red wine spreading across the documents like a fresh wound. "Alicia," he whispered, his voice cracking. "But you're," the doctors said. "The doctors said I might never walk again," Alicia said, her voice steady and lethal as she approached the table. "They didn't say I couldn't fight, and they certainly didn't say I would stay quiet while a scavenger tried to pick the bones of my parents' legacy." She reached the head of the table, leaning her weight on the cane as she stared down at the man she had once called her husband. The board members were in a state of shock, some standing in a reflex of respect, others staring at her as if she were a specter. "The sale is over, Malcolm," she said, her fingers tapping the wine-soaked deed. "I believe you'll find that the morality and lineage clause in the Brooks Charter requires the blood heir's physical signature for any disposal of family land. And since I am very much of sound mind and very much alive, your signature on these papers is worth less than the paper they're printed on." Yi-Won stepped forward, tossing a thick legal folder onto the table next to the shattered glass. "My associates have been very busy, Malcolm. We have the digital footprints of every transfer you made while Alicia was in her coma. We have the forged notary stamps. We even have the recording of the process server delivering divorce papers to a woman who couldn't stand up. In this city, my word carries a certain weight. And my word says that everything you've touched in the last 3 months is a crime." Malcolm looked from Alicia's cold, triumphant face to Yi-Won's dark, predatory gaze. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He hadn't just been outmaneuvered, he had been hunted. The woman he had discarded as obsolete had found a protector in the one man Malcolm could never hope to challenge. "You can't do this," Malcolm hissed, though the terror in his eyes betrayed him. "I am the owner of these assets. I have the power of attorney." "The power of attorney was revoked the moment I woke up," Alicia said, a small, dangerous smile finally touching her lips. "And as for the assets, you'll find that Brooks Global has already filed for a full injunction. You don't own the buildings, Malcolm. You don't even own the suit you're wearing. Everything you stole is being returned to the Brooks estate, effective immediately." Yi-Won leaned in close to Malcolm, his voice a whisper that carried to every corner of the room. "The police are waiting in the lobby, Malcolm. But if it were up to me, you wouldn't make it to the lobby. You should be grateful that Alicia believes in the law. I prefer more traditional methods of debt collection." Malcolm slumped back into the chair, the weight of his defeat finally crushing him. The paperwork predator was trapped. Alicia turned away from him, her gaze meeting the eyes of the board members who had once served her father. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice ringing with the authority of the Diamond of the South, "I believe we have a company to rebuild. Malcolm, please leave. You're staining the furniture." As the security team, Yi-Won's men, not the ones Malcolm had hired, stepped forward to escort a trembling Malcolm out of the room, Alicia felt a profound sense of closure. She looked at Yi-Won, who stood by the window, his silhouette dark against the city lights. He gave her a single, respectful nod. The board meeting was over, and for the first time in months, the Brooks legacy was safe. The Queen had reclaimed her throne, and she hadn't done it alone. The silence following Alicia's declaration was heavy, broken only by the sound of Malcolm's ragged, uneven breathing. He looked small in the high-backed leather chair, his arrogance stripped away to reveal the hollow core of a man who had never built anything of his own. As Yi-Won's security team closed in, the double doors of the boardroom opened once more, but this time it was the authorities. 2 uniformed officers and a plainclothes detective stepped into the room, their eyes moving from the wine-stained table to the trembling man at its head. "Malcolm Brooks," the detective said, his voice echoing with a finality that signaled the end of the perfect lie. "You're under arrest for grand larceny, multiple counts of document forgery, and conspiracy to commit financial fraud. You have the right to remain silent." Malcolm didn't struggle. He looked at Alicia one last time, perhaps searching for a glimmer of the soft, easily manipulated woman he had married. But he found only a stranger, a woman whose almond-shaped eyes were as hard as the skyscrapers she owned. As the handcuffs clicked into place, the sound sharp and metallic in the quiet room, Malcolm was led away. He didn't look back, and Alicia didn't watch him go. She was already looking toward the future. The board members, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, began to filter out, offering hurried apologies and stilted congratulations. They knew their positions were precarious, and they were right to be afraid. Alicia let them leave. She would deal with the house cleaning of Brooks Global in the coming weeks. For now, there was only the quiet of the evening and the man who stood by the window, watching her with an expression that went beyond business or debt. Yiwon walked toward her, his footsteps silent on the thick carpet. He stopped a few feet away, respecting the space she had fought so hard to reclaim. "It's over, Alicia," he said softly. "The empire is yours again." "It's more than an empire, Yiwon," Alicia replied, leaning her cane against the obsidian table. She looked at her hands, which were no longer trembling. "It's my parents' name, it's my dignity, but I realized something while I was in that hospital bed. A throne is just a seat if there's no one to share the view with." She looked at the carbon fiber cane, then back at Yiwon. With a deep, steadying breath, she moved her hand away from the table's edge. For a moment, she swayed, her muscles screaming with the effort of supporting her own weight. Yiwon's instinctive reaction was to reach out, but he stopped himself, knowing this was a victory she needed to win alone. Alicia took a step. It was small, shaky, and required an enormous amount of focus, but it was hers. Then another. She moved across the room toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, her ivory power suit shimmering in the moonlight. She was the queen reclaiming her throne, but she wasn't retreating into a fortress. She was stepping out of it. "I spent my whole life trying to be strong enough to never need anyone," she said, looking out at the city lights. "I thought love was a weakness Malcolm used to break me, but you showed me that true strength is knowing who to trust when you're at your lowest." Yiwon joined her at the window, the Mafia boss and the Diamond of the South, standing side by side. The contrast was striking, the dark suit and the white silk, the shadow and the light, but they fit together like two pieces of a broken world finally finding their alignment. "I didn't do this to collect a debt, Alicia," Yiwon admitted, his voice dropping to a low, intimate frequency. "I did it because 10 years ago, you gave a lonely boy a reason to believe he could be more than what his family expected. You saw me. It was only fair that I saw you when the rest of the world looked away." Alicia reached out, her fingers brushing against the sleeve of his tailored jacket. He didn't pull away. Instead, he turned his hand over, interlacing his fingers with hers. It wasn't a business transaction or a partnership born of necessity. It was a beginning. In the months that followed, the story of Alicia Brooks became a legend in Atlanta, a tale of a woman who rose from the mud of a rainy street to take back her crown. Malcolm's trial was swift, his mountain of evidence far too high for any lawyer to climb. He was sentenced to decades in a federal facility, a place where his wine glasses would be plastic, and his only company would be the walls he had built for himself. Alicia didn't just rebuild Brooks Global, she transformed it. She used her resources to build rehabilitation centers for those the city had discarded, ensuring that no one else would have to face the darkness of a government home alone. And at her side always was Yiwon. They didn't rush into a fairy tale. They built something real, something forged in the fire of justice and tempered by the quiet moments of pepper soup at midnight and walks in the garden where Alicia no longer needed a cane. As the sun rose on a new year, Alicia stood on the balcony of her home, the one that had truly become a sanctuary. She felt the warmth of the light on her face and the solid ground beneath her feet. She was Alicia Brooks, the heiress who had lost everything and found something far more valuable, a love that didn't care about bank accounts, and a strength that came from never having to walk alone again. The queen was back, and this time, her throne was built on a foundation that could never be shaken. Malcolm thought he could throw a human being away like trash, but he didn't realize who was waiting in the shadows to pick her up. If you believe everyone gets what they deserve in the end, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Don't let stories of justice like this stay hidden. Because in this city, a diamond might get scuffed, but a snake always ends up in the dirt. The Brooks legacy is back, and this time it's untouchable. Thanks for staying with us. Stay blessed and stay beautiful. Love you all.